When I was around 13, I had the chance to go on a church-organized trip to a youth camp nestled deep in the Colorado mountains. It was the kind of trip every teen looks forward to. No parents, endless outdoor activities, and the excitement of being surrounded by friends. The camp was picture perfect. Towering pine trees, crystal clear streams, and an endless sky above us. My friends and I were soaking it all in. I was bunked in a cabin with about a dozen other boys my age, along with our camp counselor, Jeff. Jeff was the kind of guy you instantly liked. Easygoing, always cracking jokes, and just really great at making everyone feel comfortable. Looking back, he was one of those counselors you could trust, which probably explains why we followed him when we should have turned back. One day, after a morning packed with activities, our group set out on a long hike into the heart of the mountains. We were gone for hours, laughing, exploring, and soaking in the wild beauty around us. When we reached the peak, Jeff announced we'd have an hour to do whatever we wanted before heading back. Most of the guys collapsed in exhaustion or went off exploring the immediate area. But Jeff had something else in mind for a few of us. He pulled me and 3 other boys aside and told us about an abandoned cabin he and another counselor had found the week before. He hadn't had time to explore it fully back then, but today we could check it out. He made it sound like a fun adventure, something that wasn't on the camp's schedule. We were excited by the idea of doing something a little rebellious, so naturally we all agreed to go. I remember the walk to the cabin vividly, though the details have grown hazy with age. The further we hiked, the quieter the forest became. It wasn't that the other campers' voices were fading. The woods themselves seemed to fall into silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness. And then, the cabin came into view. It was an unassuming place, hidden in a small clearing. A basic wooden structure, clearly aged and worn by years of neglect, but nothing out of the ordinary at first glance. Yet, as soon as I saw it, a chill crawled down my spine. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but something about that cabin felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for us to make a move. "Looks normal, right?" Jeff said as he peered through one of the windows. I didn't answer, but I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows of the woods. The other guys were quiet too, their usual banter absent. Jeff, however, was undeterred. He tried the door, which creaked open as if it had been waiting for us. "Come on, let's check it out," he said, stepping inside. Reluctantly, we followed. The inside was surprisingly empty. The front room took up half the cabin, with bare wooden floors and a thick layer of dust covering everything. Despite the emptiness, the sense of being watched grew stronger, and I began to feel an overwhelming hatred directed at us from somewhere. I had no idea where it was coming from, but I knew we weren't welcome. "I don't like this," one of the boys, Andy, muttered. I silently agreed, but Jeff seemed focused on exploring further. He motioned for us to follow him into the back room, and though every instinct screamed at me to leave, I went along. That's when we saw it. In the center of the room was a giant pentagram drawn in what looked like charcoal. In the middle of the pentagram sat a single wooden chair. But it wasn't just any chair. On top of it was a toilet seat, and driven through the seat were dozens of nails, each one pointing up like deadly spikes. "What the?" one of the guys started to say, but Jeff cut him off. "Let's check the last room, then we're out of here." His voice was steady, but I saw the nervous glance he shot towards the pentagram. We followed him into the final room, and that's when things went from creepy to terrifying. There, sitting on an old gas stove, was a pot of water, boiling. Steam rose from the pot in lazy tendrils, filling the room with a strange metallic smell. But here's the thing. There was no one there to light the stove. It was as if the cabin had been abandoned for years, yet here was a pot, actively boiling as if someone had just left. Jeff's face went pale. "We need to leave. Now." We didn't ask questions. We bolted out of the cabin and into the woods, sprinting faster than I ever thought possible. As we ran, I swear I could hear a low buzzing in my ears, like the sound of 1,000 angry bees. The feeling of being watched grew more intense, and for the first time, I truly felt like we were being hunted. When we finally reached the rendezvous point, Jeff made us promise not to say a word about what had happened. "They'll think we're crazy," he said, his voice shaky. And honestly, I agreed. Who would believe us? The rest of the camp passed uneventfully, though the memory of that cabin lingered in the back of my mind. It wasn't until we got back home that I started to piece things together. One night, a few months later, I was scrolling through some old articles online, researching the area where our camp had been. That's when I found it. Years ago, there had been reports of a cult operating in that part of the Colorado mountains. They performed strange rituals, leaving behind pentagrams and other occult symbols. The authorities had found evidence of human sacrifice, though no bodies were ever recovered. The cult was said to have disbanded decades ago, but locals still claimed to hear strange noises in the woods at night. I closed my laptop, my heart racing. The cabin, the pentagram, the boiling pot. It all made sense now. We had stumbled upon something we were never meant to see. And as I lay there in the dark, a terrifying thought crossed my mind. What if they had been watching us the whole time? What if they were still out there? What if someone else found that spot too, but never made it out? It was Oliver's 16th birthday, and his parents had thrown him a party at their massive property, just on the outskirts of Brisbane, Australia. The house was an old colonial-style estate, but it was the surrounding 10 acres of dense woodland that made it feel like an adventure. About 20 of us had shown up, excited for a night of games, food, and maybe some spooky stories by the fire. After the cake was cut and the night grew darker, we decided to up the ante. Someone suggested a game of murder in the dark in the woods, and the idea spread like wildfire. My best mate Tom and I wanted to go all out. We grabbed an old ladder from the side of Oliver's garage, thinking we'd climb a tall tree deep in the woods and pull the ladder up after us. No one would ever find us, we figured. It seemed like the perfect plan, until things took a strange and eerie turn. We could hear the it person counting loudly, his voice echoing across the property. 98, 99, 100 exclamation mark. We had already disappeared into the thick brush by then, lugging the ladder between us. The trees were tall and gnarled, their branches reaching overhead like skeletal arms, making the world feel smaller and more enclosed. We joked and laughed about how we'd be the last ones found, no matter what. Then everything went quiet. Not the kind of quiet where you just stop hearing your friend's voice or the rustling of the trees. It was as if the forest itself had gone completely mute. No crickets, no birds, not even the wind through the leaves. Tom and I stopped in our tracks, looking at each other in confusion. "You hear that?" he whispered. I strained my ears, and that's when we both caught it. A soft, rhythmic thumping. It sounded like hoofbeats, slow at first, coming from somewhere deep ahead of us. But there were no horses on Oliver's property, and the sound seemed off, almost hollow. It wasn't galloping, not exactly, but something similar. It was getting louder. "Let's get up the tree," Tom suggested. But there was no way I was taking my eyes off the dark path ahead. Then, as if to make matters worse, a faint light appeared through the trees, slowly flickering. It wasn't the kind of light you'd expect from a flashlight. This light had an unnatural, bluish glow to it, growing brighter as the thumping sound grew louder, more insistent. "Forget the ladder, let's go," I shouted. Tom didn't argue. We turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush as fast as we could, our breathing heavy, our hearts pounding louder than the strange noise behind us. It felt like the forest was closing in on us, the trees moving to trap us. The thumping was so close now I swore it was right behind us. We finally burst out of the woods, breathless, and collapsed onto Oliver's front lawn. The others, still playing the game, were startled by our sudden appearance. "What happened to you two?" Oliver asked, a smirk on his face, thinking we'd been scared by our shadows. Tom and I, gasping for air, explained what we'd heard and seen. The laughter stopped. There was something in our voices, fear, real fear, that made them all take us seriously. Oliver's dad, a no-nonsense kind of guy, listened as well, his face unreadable. After we finished, he simply said, "Go get my ladder back." There was no way we were going back into those woods alone. So, armed with flashlights and a bit of peer pressure, we convinced everyone to come with us. All 20 of us, torches in hand, retraced our steps, heading back into the woods. The forest seemed less eerie with the group, the night noises returning as though nothing strange had ever happened. I kept waiting for that dead silence to return, but it didn't. After about 10 minutes, we found the ladder. It wasn't lying on the ground where we dropped it. Instead, it was perfectly set up in the middle of a small clearing. Stranger still, the entire ladder was soaking wet, though there hadn't been any rain. The ground beneath it was dry, the trees around untouched by water, but the ladder dripped as if it had just been pulled out of a river. "Did you two set this up?" one of the guys asked, but Tom and I just shook our heads. Oliver's dad stepped forward, his flashlight shining on the ladder, then around the clearing. His expression grew grim. "We're leaving," he said firmly. No one argued. We headed back to the house, a growing unease settling in among the group. That night, no one mentioned the incident again. Tom and I couldn't stop thinking about the ladder. Something felt wrong, like we had escaped something we didn't fully understand. But things didn't end there. Weeks later, Oliver told me his dad had taken the ladder back to the garage, but it kept moving. They'd find it leaning against different trees, even though no one had touched it. One morning, they found the ladder back in the clearing, wet again. That's when his dad chopped it up and burned it. After that, the noises stopped, and the ladder was never seen again. I thought that was the end of the strange experience. That was, until a year later. I had almost forgotten about that night in the woods until Oliver invited me over to his house again for a weekend camping trip on his family's property. We were in the middle of setting up camp when Oliver's younger brother came running over, pale as a ghost. "You've got to see this," he panted. We followed him deeper into the woods near their property, and there, standing upright in the middle of a small clearing, was the ladder. Not just any ladder, the ladder. The same one Oliver's dad had chopped up and burned. It was wet, droplets trickling down its sides. We never camped again. Growing up off-grid on a remote Oregon mountainside, life wasn't exactly normal. With no power, no phone, and no neighbors within a mile, the isolation became my normal. I was used to the solitude, but I also knew there was a lot of life in those woods. Life you could feel, and sometimes hear, when you were alone, walking in the pitch dark with nothing but the wind and your heartbeat to keep you company. As a young teen, I'd often trek the 2 miles to my friend Leo's house. Leo's family lived closer to the main road, and they had luxuries I didn't, like lights and TV. I'd take the trip barefoot, following a dirt path through the thick forest, sometimes in total darkness. My parents didn't have much money, so new shoes were out of the question. Besides, I had gotten used to it. The trick was to feel the trail underfoot and follow the gaps in the trees overhead, like invisible breadcrumbs leading me to my destination. The woods were my playground and my escape. Every tree, every rock, and every sound was familiar to me. I thought I knew everything about the forest, its rhythms, and its dangers. I'd heard the occasional howl of a wolf in the distance, and even seen a black bear scurry through the trees, but none of that scared me. The woods were home, and the home was supposed to be safe. One fall evening, as the sun began to set and the cool night crept in, I set out for Leo's house. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the leaves crunched softly under my feet. My path, usually clear and comforting, suddenly felt different. There was something heavier in the air, something that made the woods feel less familiar and more watchful. Still, I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just the chill of the approaching winter. A few days later, something changed. Leo's family kept a small herd of sheep in a fenced-in area near their house. One evening, while walking home from Leo's place, I came across something on the trail. A bright patch of white where there shouldn't have been one. Even in the moonlight, it stood out, stark and wrong. My heart pounded as I got closer, my curiosity overpowering my sense of fear. There, lying beside the trail, was the mangled body of one of Leo's sheep. Its throat was torn open, and its body was halfway devoured. Blood soaked the ground, dark and sticky in the moonlight. The forest was eerily quiet, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I didn't stick around to find out what that something was. I ran the rest of the way home, barefoot and gasping for breath, trying to shake the image from my mind. But no matter how hard I tried, the sight of that mutilated sheep haunted me. The next day, I told Leo and his family what I had seen. They were shocked, of course, but not entirely surprised. Predators were common in the area, and it wasn't unheard of for cougars or bears to attack livestock. Still, there was something unsettling about it. Why hadn't the predator finished its meal? Why drag the carcass halfway between our homes only to leave it by the trail? In the days that followed, every time I walked through the woods, I felt eyes on me. Unseen, but undeniably there. I started taking a different route to Leo's house, hoping it would ease my paranoia, but it didn't. In fact, it made things worse. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard something outside my window. A soft rustling, like someone, or something, was moving through the underbrush. I froze, my heart racing, as I listened to the sounds of something heavy shuffling just beyond the thin walls of our cabin. I didn't dare move. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds faded, but the fear lingered. The final straw came a week later. Leo's father, concerned for the safety of the remaining sheep, decided to investigate the area near the trail where I had found the carcass. Armed with a rifle, he scoured the woods, looking for any sign of the predator. Hours passed, and when he didn't return, Leo and I went out to look for him. We found him near the edge of the forest, standing in a clearing, staring at the ground. At first, I thought he was just looking at tracks or some other clue. But as we got closer, I saw what had frozen him in place. In the center of the clearing, etched into the dirt, were strange symbols. Circles, lines, and what looked like runes. In the middle of the symbols was a small pile of bones, arranged in a pattern too deliberate to be accidental. It wasn't the work of a wild animal. This was something else. Something darker. Something human. Leo's father destroyed the symbols in the bones, insisting it was just some sick prank played by kids. But I knew better. This was no prank. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the rustling again. But this time it was closer. Much closer. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, and stared at the window. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long, twisted shadows across the floor. And then I saw it. A figure, standing just outside my window, its face obscured by the darkness. It was tall and thin, with long arms that hung unnaturally at its sides. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew it was watching me. I scrambled out of bed and ran to my parents' room, waking them with frantic whispers. My father grabbed his rifle and rushed outside. But by the time he got there, the figure was gone. The next day, we found more of the strange symbols carved into the trees near our cabin. This time, they were accompanied by small, crude dolls made of twigs and bones, hanging from the branches like macabre ornaments. It was then that we realized this wasn't just an animal stalking us. It was something far worse. In the weeks that followed, the strange occurrences escalated. The footsteps, the growls, the symbols. They all became more frequent, more aggressive. We were being hunted, not by a wild animal, but by something ancient and malevolent. And then, one night, it stopped. The sounds, the symbols, the figure outside my window. It all just stopped. For weeks, we heard nothing, saw nothing. It was as if whatever had been stalking us had simply lost interest. But I knew better.